Today I'm going to start with chapter 5. Yesterday we found that Rena has lost everything and she's in a tiny apartment with two other families. And this is just going to continue from there. Chapter 5, 1942, Liquidation of the Krakow Ghetto. We saw death every day in the Krakow Ghetto. My father had a good friend named Rudy. They used to play cards together. One day, my father came home with an ashen face. He told us that he and Rudy had been standing in front of the ghetto hospital when a German officer walked by, fired his gun, and killed Rudy. The German had no reason to shoot Rudy other than he was a Jew. On December the 31st, 1942, German soldiers burst into our apartment and arrested my father. It no longer mattered that my father had a work permit. It no longer mattered that he was a good person who never did anything wrong. The Germans decided the time had come for him to die. Imagine being 13 years old and seeing your father marched away to be murdered. Later, I found out the reason my father had been arrested. There was another Jew in the ghetto who was jealous of my father's popularity and had lied to the police that my father was active in the underground. The underground was a secret organization of young men and women who fought the Germans by stealing their weapons, blowing up Nazi offices, and enlisting others to resist the German occupation of Poland. In the Krakow ghetto, there was such an underground group of young resistors, but my father never had anything to do with them. My mother and I were frantic and looking for someone who could get my father released, but we had no luck. The Germans kept him in the ghetto jail for 1 week, then put him on a transport to Auschwitz. In my eyes, my father was the smartest, strongest man in the world, and I was sure nothing would happen to him. Somehow, I told myself, he would figure out how to survive. Those were the hopes of a naive 13-year-old girl. What did I know about Auschwitz or the horrors that happened there? The days the German deported my father was the day I saw him the last time. In the beginning, before the Germans decided to liquidate, meaning shut down, the Krakow ghetto, few people knew where the transports were going. The Germans lied that the trains took Jews to farms where they grew food for the German army, and many Jews in the ghetto forced themselves to believe this was true. After all, who wanted to think their family members were being sent just to be killed? But then the German government started sending made-up postcards to people in the ghetto that read, "Sorry to inform you that this or that person from your family has died of natural causes." For a while, the Germans even sent boxes of ashes with a note, "Here are the remains of your loved one." Then we heard that the Krakow ghetto was to be liquidated, and even the most hopeful Jews understood the truth. No one was being sent away to work on a farm. They were being sent away to die. The only Jews allowed to live were those whom the Germans deemed fit for work, meaning between the ages of 12 and 55. My mother's parents were nearly 70 years old. To save them from the transports, my mother and her younger sister brought their parents out into the courtyard of our building and told them to hide under a pile of leaves. My grandparents told me to hide with them, and I wasn't sure why, because I was 13 and allowed to stay in the ghetto. But I did what they wanted. My grandparents and I stretched out on our stomachs and crawled under a pile of leaves and dirt. "Stay still and quiet," my mother whispered to us. Then she and my aunt left to go to their work. From under the pile of dirt, I felt the ground shake as trucks carrying soldiers rolled through the ghetto. A few minutes later, I heard soldiers marching into our building and going door to door, rounding up any old people they found hiding. Just to make their elderly Jewish prisoners more miserable, the soldiers took chairs and tables from their apartments and threw them out the window. Furniture crashed on the courtyard ground. Then the soldiers marched their prisoners down the stairs, out through the gates of the courtyard, and lined them up against a brick wall. We heard shots and people screaming. After a while, it got quiet. Some hours later, my mother returned from work. "You can come out now," she said. Everybody's gone. My grandparents and I stood up and brushed the leaves off our clothes. Just when we thought my grandparents were safe, something terrible happened. 2 German soldiers, making a final inspection of the ghetto, walked into the courtyard. Seeing the dirt and leaves on my grandparents' hair, it was obvious they'd been hiding. My grandmother bent down and whispered to me, "We'll be okay." She took my grandfather's hand, and the soldiers marched them away. I will never forget the expression on my mother's face, watching her parents walking away to be murdered. It was horrible. We went back to our apartment and did our best to repair the damage done by the soldiers, but some destruction can't be repaired. The liquidation of the Krakow ghetto continued. For 4 days, German soldiers went door to door, rounding up Jews. In those 4 days, 2,000 men, women, and children were sent to the Plaszow concentration camp 2 miles away. 3,000 were sent to be murdered in Auschwitz, and 2,000 more were killed on the spot. The Germans gathered together all the Jews, those who possessed work permits, and told them that they would be recloaded to Plaszow. Many of the ghetto workshops had already been relocated there, including the printing shop where my mother and I had been assigned. We assembled by the gates of the ghetto and set out on forced march to Plaszow concentration camp. Chapter 6, the Plaszow concentration camp. Children under the age of 10 were not allowed into the Plaszow camp. Instead, before Jewish parents left on the march to Plaszow, police forced them to send their young children to the Krakow ghetto's orphanage. Some parents tried to bring their little children with them to Plaszow by giving them a sleeping pill and hiding them in backpacks. My cousin Jenny was too big to hide in a backpack, but I was desperate to bring her with us to Plaszow. Even though the concentration camp would be horrible, at least if we were together, I could look after her. An idea came to me. I would hide her under my long coat. As my mother and I approached the gates of the ghetto, a policeman saw Jenny's feet under my coat. He opened the coat and looked at my beautiful little cousin, who was clearly less than 10 years old. "You can't take her," he said. "She's too young. She must stay here. Let the orphanage take care of her." My mother and I knew some of the people who ran the orphanage and told ourselves Jenny would be fine staying with them. What choice did we have? I took Jenny by the hand, and together we walked back inside the ghetto. It was only a few blocks down empty streets, past empty buildings. We arrived at the orphanage. Several hundred children had been assembled outside the building. I recognized the woman supervising them. She was a friend of my mother. "Don't worry," she told me, taking Jenny by the hand. "I will take care of her." I kissed Jenny goodbye and walked back to join my mother by the gates of the ghetto for the 2-mile march to Plaszow. Police started the march, and just as we began walking away from the ghetto, we heard gunshots. I felt a terrible chill. Surely the shots were coming from someplace else, not the orphanage. But as we continued toward Plaszow, someone came up and whispered that the children in the orphanage had been murdered. Could it be true? My mother and I walked on speechless, too shaken to say anything. Dogs barked, and the Nazi security police, known as the SS, yelled, "Mach schnell! Hurry!" We quickened our pace and marched to Plaszow, still hearing shots being fired in the ghetto. We arrived at the Plaszow camp, which was a total size of about 100 city blocks. There were 88 barracks in the camp, hosting about 25,000 inmates, all of them Jews. When we arrived, police divided Jews from the Krakow ghetto into groups and marched them to their assigned barracks. My mother and I were pushed into a crowded barrack with bunk beds 3 tiers high like wooden shelves, too narrow to sit up in. Apart from the barracks, Plaszow had one filthy latrine that was always overflowing, a clinic that never had any medical supplies, and workshops where prisoners labored each day. We adjusted to the daily routine. At 4 o'clock in the morning, guards made a young musician from Krakow play his bugle to wake us up. Prisoners ran outside and stood at attention for hours while roll call was taken. This was in winter, and many mornings were freezing cold. German officers went up and down the lines of prisoners. If one person was missing, the roll call had to be taken again, and we were forced to stand for hours, often in rain or snow. There were sick people among the prisoners who could not stand for long, but if they sat down, it meant they were not strong enough to work, and guards dragged them off to be killed. We were always hungry in the Plaszow camp. Hungry, as most people understand the word today, is different from hungry in a concentration camp. Hungry in a camp meant a twisting, painful sensation in your stomach that made you dizzy and weak and never went away. Our hope was that there could be enough food to keep us alive until the next morning. Our food was also not food as people understand it. Food in a concentration camp meant a foul-smelling bowl of watery soup and a piece of stale bread. Throughout the day, we were always looking for something more to eat. We were ready to eat anything. Guards stood by the garbage piles outside the inmate kitchen and shot anyone desperately hungry enough to dig through the garbage for scraps. The commandant of the Plaszow camp was a German officer named Amon Goeth. Oh, let's see, it says Git. That's how you're supposed to pronounce that. Amon Git. We heard that Git had grown up in Vienna, the cultured capital of Austria, so we hoped he would be a reasonable man. He turned out to be just the opposite. He was horrible and inhuman. Amon Git was 6 feet 4 inches tall, overweight, and brutal. Even in the camp, his reputation was known by everyone, and everyone stayed as far away from him as possible. He lived in a villa on a hill about 100 yards from the main gates of Plaszow. Each morning he stood on the balcony of his villa, aimed his rifle at people coming and going inside the camp, fired his gun, and killed prisoners at random. My uncle, Roman, worked as a painter in Plaszow. One morning, the guards put him to work painting one of the barracks. Amon Git came to inspect his work. He looked at the barrack, then drew his pistol, shot, and killed my uncle. Roman had done nothing to provoke him. Git had no reason to kill my uncle than his disdain for human life. Prisoners who'd been in Plaszow for some time told Git never ate his breakfast without at least killing one person first. Killing made him happy. Some days, Git forced us to witness prisoners being murdered. These poor people may have been guilty of some minor offense, such as stealing potato peels out of the garbage, but it didn't matter. They were Jews, and that was reason enough for Git to have the guards kill them. Life in the Krakow ghetto had been harsh, but that was nothing like we saw in Plaszow, where every day Commandant Git committed terrible acts. Thankfully, during that terrible year in Plaszow, I began hearing the name Oskar Schindler. So maybe good times are coming. I'll see you guys tomorrow.